name is Ben Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director for the City's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. For those who don't know us, we are a city office that is mandated by city charter, tasked with tracking climate change science and potential impacts on city facilities, coordinating actions and policies of departments within the city to increase community preparedness, developing resilient infrastructure in response to the effects of climate change, and integrating sustainable and environmental values into city plans, programs, and policies. So again, we're here tonight to hear from the Federal Emergency Management Agency about their update to the proposed flood maps for Oʻahu. Why is CCSR here? Why is the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency here? And the city? Well, the city participates in the National Flood Insurance Program through CCSR and the Department of Planning and Permitting, who you're going to hear from in just a moment. Our office works closely with the Department of Planning and Permitting on a program called the Community Rating System, which importantly is something that actually provides discounts on the federal flood insurance program that you're going to hear about more tonight. So if you could go to the next slide, Chelsea. Thank you. This is a brief agenda for tonight, which really describes the things we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about National Flood Insurance Program participation. So that's NFIP right there. And then we're going to talk about FEMA mapping, Federal Energy Management Agency mapping background. How did they get this preliminary data to develop these maps will be covered. They are going to review your preliminary flood data and show you the tools that are available to do that yourself. And they're going to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, flood insurance specifically, and what that means and what's available to you as a homeowner or as a business. And then they're going to talk about the next steps and timelines with regards to this, with regards to these preliminary flood maps. So if you could go to the next slide, the participating agencies. So the city and county is here to introduce folks and talk about our role in the NFIP program. That we also are collaborating with the State Department of Land and Natural Resources, which is a liaison to FEMA in many cases for this program and helps with eligibility. And then, of course, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who is responsible for administering the program and updating the flood maps and whatnot, is the primary presenter tonight, and they will be giving a lot of information to the folks on the call. So if you could go to the next slide, I will introduce my colleague, Mario Su Lee, who is from the Department of Planning and Permitting, and he'll explain in more detail how the city participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. Mario, over to you.
And Mario, you may be muted on your side.
Here.
That's great.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Mario Su Lee. I'm a planner with the Department of Planning and Permitting, and I spent a lot of my career in floodplain management, besides regulating development for the city and county. Next slide. My presentation is basically to provide some background about this city and county Honolulu's participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. As you may know, the National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program that was established by an act of Congress in 1968. The purpose of the program is to provide flood insurance to property owners as financial protection against flood losses. I think it was established at a time that flood insurance was unavailable or difficult to obtain. For FEMA to provide this flood insurance, a community has to join the program. And in this case, the city has joined the program since 1980. Essentially, the participation in this program also not only allows for flood insurance to be made available to the community members, but also allows access to several types of federal disaster assistance that would otherwise not be available. Next slide, please. Participation in this program requires certain compliance with requisites, I guess. So two of them that the city has to participate is in adopting federal flood maps that identify areas that are at high risk of flooding, that are usually called special flood hazard areas. and also to have a flood ordinance in place that regulates development. In the case of Honolulu, that ordinance is Chapter 21A of the revised ordinances of Honolulu. Next slide, please. Chapter 21A is administered by the Department of Planning and Permitting. Requirements apply to building permits, to any kind of development or construction within those special flood hazard areas. And the ordinance also establishes standards for new and substantially improved buildings in flood areas. It also outlines the requirements for certification before and after construction. The ordinance allows for the continuous adoption of flood maps, and also allows for procedures to submit reports or amendments to the different flood hazard areas. Next slide, please. Going to the federal flood insurance rate maps, these are very important tools that communities can use to understand how likely it is for an area to flood, and for homeowners to use that information to reduce their exposure to flood damage. Since they are called flood insurance rate maps, they are also the basis to determine which properties are subject to mandatory flood insurance requirements whenever a real property is used to secure a federally insured mortgage or loan. The department also uses the flood maps as a regulatory tool. The information that is on the flood maps identifies properties and also buildings or structures that may be subject to those standards that protect them from flooding. The slide shows a view of the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency webpage, where there is a blue button where the FEMA maps can be accessed. The city has developed a viewer that allows the public to compare the existing current flood maps with the new preliminary maps and see how the information is proposed to change. Next slide, please. The city joined the community rating system as part of its efforts to increase resiliency and out of concern too about the cost of flood insurance. With the cost of flood insurance rising every year, the city decided to join the community rating system, which is a sister program of the National Flood Insurance Program. This community rating system provides flood insurance premium discounts to property owners on Oʻahu based on the city's efforts to exceed the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. Currently, through this community rating system, property owners have been receiving a 10% discount in their flood insurance premium for the past 3 years. The city is going to continue efforts to qualify for additional discounts and thus increase the affordability of flood insurance for Oʻahu residents. Next slide. This slide shows information about the number of parcels or properties that are affected by the proposed map change. The DPP estimates that there are approximately 172,000 parcels on Oʻahu. Currently, 15,000 of those parcels are located within special flood hazard areas. And there are different acronyms identifying them. With the preliminary map revision, the number will increase from 15,000 to 18,700 approximately. in addition to the parcels that are being placed in the special flood hazard areas, the map revision also will change 55,000 parcels from Zone D, undetermined flood risk, to unshaded Zone X, which are areas of lower flood risks. And this will be beneficial in a lot of ways. In cases where lenders or mortgage companies or agencies may question whether a property in Zone D is exposed to flooding, those that are changing to Zone X can definitely indicate that they are no longer exposed to that amount of risk. Next slide. So basically, this is contact information. The department has a website, and you can email your inquiries to dpp@honolulu.gov. And for the CRS, inquiries can be directed to the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. If there are any questions I can answer at this moment, I can try to do that, or otherwise, we can wait until the end of the presentation. At this point, I would like to introduce our presenters from FEMA. The next presenter is Eric Simmons, mapping specialist from FEMA Region 9, and he will present information about the preliminary flood maps.
Yeah, thanks, Mario. Appreciate that and value very much our working on flood mapping and in flood loss reductions. And a little background on me, I'm an engineer with FEMA, so most of my work has been under flood hazard mapping, especially when disasters haven't been declared. So gonna try to provide a little background on FEMA flood maps for those that are less familiar with those products, and then also talk about the process to update these flood maps and specifically talk about the milestones and schedule for the Honolulu flood map revision. So this slide kind of covers some of the concepts you just heard from Mario about these key terms, and some of us specifically call it a flood insurance rate map, but it's the FEMA flood map, which is the official map of a community that shows these premium zones, these risk premium zones. And the most important zones on those flood maps are what also are called special flood hazard areas, okay? So the flood maps show areas of high risk, moderate risk, and low risk, okay? And these high risk zones are called special flood hazard areas, and they're subject to that 1% annual chance flood. Okay, so they're within that 1% annual chance floodplain, and it's any FEMA zone that begins with the letter A as in apple or V as in Victor. So that's the most important information there. It's has that insurance implication and development standard considerations at the Honolulu side. And within that special flood hazard area, many of these flood zones have a base flood elevation. That is the elevation of that 1% annual chance flood, okay? Outside of the special flood hazard area are moderate and low hazard areas. Those are mapped Zone X by FEMA. So that's where flood insurance is typically not mandated by a lender, okay? And then currently for Oʻahu, much of the island is mapped Zone D. It's a possible but undetermined flood hazard. And realize that for this map revision, we're studying many of those streams in that Zone D for the first time. So to look at a little bit more of the mapping, next slide, please, is a cross-sectional view of a stream. Okay, so for the ongoing map revision for Honolulu, the new information is all riverine along streams and canals. Saw how there was a chat about stormwater flooding. That's often called pluvial flooding. FEMA flood maps don't depict that type of flooding, but this is along streams and those channels. And here you can see in this cross-sectional view, the 1% annual chance floodplain, okay, which is called the special flood hazard area, okay. Within some of those special flood hazard areas along streams is a regulatory floodway. It's a area that's has importance for floodplain management. But outside of that high-risk area, the 1% annual chance floodplain is a moderate hazard area. And the nationwide standard for mapping that is based on the 0.2% annual chance floodplain, sometimes called the 500-year floodplain. And areas outside of that 0.2% annual chance floodplain is unshaded zone X, so it even has a lower flood hazard. So let's transition from this cross-sectional view to the next slide, kind of looking down on our topography and land. And here's a screenshot of the July 2024 preliminary firm, just an example. But it's important to realize what's happening with FEMA and updated flood mapping for Oʻahu. This proposed update includes new mapping for over 400 stream miles. So it's a large study. It's using very detailed topographic data. So there's a technology called light detection and ranging where we have very detailed topographic data for the floodplains, for the channels, for overbank areas. And this updated mapping reflects the latest conditions, existing conditions. So any kind of physical changes that may have been made over the last years and decades reflects that. FEMA also has smaller letters of map change that are being incorporated into this revision. And you can see on this graphic, the screenshot here, how that blue shaded area is that high risk area. The moderate hazard area is that orangish, brownish shade, and then unshaded is a low hazard area. Next slide, please. And it's important to realize too, it's not all of the flood zones for Oʻahu are being updated, but it is a large percentage. It's along over 400 miles of stream areas. In this revision, no new coastal flood hazard data. But you can see this graphic, the panel boundaries that are highlighted in yellow, those are the ones that were issued by FEMA in preliminary format on July 31st of this year. Okay, so there's some panels that are not currently proposed to be updated, but most of the panels for Honolulu are. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the next 10 slides or so. So next slide, we're going to really jump into the specifics of how you can find this data. So FEMA issued the preliminary mapping, and Honolulu has developed a map viewer. So the link that should be on the chat, but also was part of the news release and information online, has this map viewer. It's a pretty cool tool. It has a slider where you can see what's currently in effect for flood insurance purposes. That's on the right side of the slider. And then on the left side are the preliminary flood zones. Okay. And we're going to look at a few examples in a little bit, but you can toggle and slide that slider back and forth to see what's currently mapped and what's in effect for flood insurance, and then what's proposed to be mapped. Okay. So this is a great tool for Honolulu residents. Also wanted to mention how all this mapping is also on FEMA's website. FEMA has mapping of the preliminary, also what's currently in effect, and historic or old flood maps are downloadable from the FEMA Map Service Center website. So let's take a look at some examples. Next slide. And here's a study example. So on the left side of the screen is what's currently mapped. It was a panel dated from 2011, and it shows a lot of Zone D, that possible but undetermined flood hazard. Okay, looking at the right side of the screen, you can see what is proposed, what the preliminary firm dated July 31st shows. So that high-risk area, in this case, it's Zone A, preliminary, is shown along these streams. Also has that moderate hazard area, the shaded Zone X, in that kind of darker green shaded area. So these this information, the screenshots from the website, you can see it on the screen right now. And one can type in their own address or Zoom or pan in, pan out. When you first go to that website, it's also just worth mentioning how there's some instructions. It talks about how to use the slider and what it shows. There's also on the website legends. So it shows you or anyone what those flood zones represent, how that darker red area is a coastal VE zone, or that magenta is that Zone A. So this is how Honolulu's website has been set up, those different shadings. And that's actually that shadings are from a state tool called a flood hazard assessment tool. And the next slide, I just wanted to highlight, if you look at actually the FEMA panels that are available online or were distributed to Honolulu, the shading's a little different, but the map information is exactly the same. So on the left side, you see that same firm panel from 2011. It shows the coastal flood hazards, but it's Zone D inland. But on the right side of the screen there, it's the same example. It shows that proposed Zone A from the preliminary from July 31st. And on the screen right now is the URL for FEMA's Map Service Center, msc.fema.gov. So I think we're going to put that in the chat also. But that's another resource for all to access FEMA mapping. Next slide, please. So let's look at some examples for specific properties. So if one can take a look at the two graphics on the left side, created these graphics to try to highlight a property with an increase in mapped risk. Okay, so the top left shows what's current, the flood zones on the current and effective flood insurance rate map for Honolulu. And if you see that parcel and building on the parcel highlighted by the yellow star, it's currently outside of that special flood hazard area. It's in a shaded Zone X. But if you look at the lower left graphic, that's the preliminary flood zones for this area. So in this case, the flood zone, the special flood hazard area is being proposed to widen, and it's including that whole parcel. So that building on that parcel is being proposed to be mapped in the special flood hazard area. In this case, it's Zone AE. And this is what those two graphics show, is a property with increased map flood risk. If you look at the two graphics on the right side, is an example of the opposite. It's a property with mapped risk decrease. So the current flood zones on the upper right, that parcel, kind of the orangish star, is a parcel and a building currently in the special flood hazard area, in that high risk area. Okay. And FEMA and FEMA's engineers and contractors have done a new study here and has a lower flood risk based on existing conditions. And that property, if you look at the lower right orange star, is being mapped in an unshaded Zone X. So it's in a low hazard area. And so that property is being proposed to be mapped with a decrease in flood risk. So just an example, these are the kinds of things we like to work with property owners on. For example, at the open house on November 6th in 2 days. But we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So now that we've talked about the mapping and kind of what it shows and ways to access it, let's look at the overall process. And FEMA needs to follow certain regulatory and by law steps to update and revise a flood insurance rate. Okay, so we're right here, kind of in the middle of the timeline. Open houses, November 4th and 6th. That preliminary map, those map panels and a supporting flood insurance study report were issued in preliminary format July 31st. Okay, FEMA and FEMA's contractors did these studies beforehand. We had shared some draft data, but looking at the next couple steps, continuing this type of outreach, we encourage wise development and look at disaster resilience. So ongoing outreach through this process. But the next major mapping milestone is a 90-day appeal period. So we're looking to start that 90-day appeal period in spring of 2025, next year. And that would go for 3 months. And that allows really any property owner, citizen, community to submit technical data and information and comments to FEMA, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. FEMA will review any of those and all those submittals and comments and appeals that are provided. If we have to update and revise a preliminary flood map panel to address a comment or an appeal, we will do that. And once those have all been resolved, FEMA then finalizes this map revision. So it's finalized through a letter from FEMA to Honolulu. Right now, the tentative schedule for that is fall 2025. And then by regulation, the revised flood zones become effective and the final map revision becomes effective 6 months after that. So that 6 months allows the city and county of Honolulu to evaluate their ordinance and if necessary, make any updates. So those are the major milestones in a flood mapping project, as well as the timeline as it goes through. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that 90-day appeal period that we anticipate early next year. Okay, so the 90-day appeal period for the preliminary flood map revision, it begins with a second newspaper notice. Okay, so what happens afterwards is FEMA does a notice in the Federal Register, and then there'll be 2 newspaper notices talking about this preliminary flood map and offering this opportunity to submit a comment or appeal. That second newspaper notice, which we plan to publish in the Star Advertiser, that second newspaper notice officially starts that 90-day period. Okay. And so comments or appeals can be submitted. Well, what's the difference? A comment proposes a change to a non-hazard element. It could be a road name, could be some kind of political boundary, and it doesn't require engineering data. Okay. Whereas all this updated flood mapping is based on technical data. It's based on new modelings. Working for FEMA, we're confident in this updated data, but it allows for the submission of data that refines it or improves it, or maybe there's been a physical change recently that shows some change in condition. So appeal proposes a change to the preliminary or draft flood hazard data. Okay, and it must be supported by certified engineering data. For example, revised modeling. Okay. And so on the FEMA side, we ask that these comments and appeals are provided to Honolulu, and they can be kind of bundled up and submitted to FEMA. They can be submitted directly to FEMA too. Any kind of resolution and coordination and aspects of this flood map revision, FEMA coordinates extensively with Honolulu. But we like to work together on that. So that's why FEMA asks to be submitted to Honolulu first. But it's important to realize it needs to be provided in that 90-day appeal period. Next slide. Okay. So my last slide here, before we talk more flood insurance, is a little bit more about these steps and specifics and somewhat a repeat of what I've already mentioned. But do want to highlight, on the left side here, that this revision process, it follows certain steps that are by law and regulation need to be followed. We call it due process. So that includes a Federal Register notice, 2 newspaper notices, and I'm happy to talk flood mapping during that time. And that's going into early 2025. And then we have this 90-day appeal period, okay? So we ask that communities like Honolulu gather all these comments and appeals, submit them to FEMA before the end of that 90-day appeal period, and work together to answer questions. But what happens after the 90-day appeal period? On the FEMA side, I work to review and resolve all these comments and appeals that were submitted, and if necessary, revise the preliminary maps to reflect better flood hazard data. Okay. And then it's finalized, this revision is finalized with a letter, we call it a letter of final determination from FEMA to Honolulu. So that would revise this ongoing revision, but realize that there's always opportunities to update and revise flood mapping. There's different processes, for example, letter of map amendment process, where that information can be provided to clarify the flood zone or a specific parcel or a building. Okay. But for this map revision, that letter of final determination finalizes that revision, and it provides 6 months for Honolulu to evaluate their flood damage reduction ordinance, to look at how they can have more points and a better standing in the community rating system, looking at other flood loss reduction efforts, focusing on resiliency. And I think that's an important thing to end with, is the reason why FEMA does this flood hazard mapping is for safety, for reducing flood losses. And if you follow the news, there's been definitely a lot of flood disasters recently and in recent years too. So wanted to hand off the next couple of slides to my colleague, Edie Lohman. She's our regional flood insurance specialist and happy to talk flood insurance. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Eric, and good evening, everyone. And Eric, before I get started, I just want to let you know there is a couple of mapping questions in the chat that I'm sure you can help out with. So great presentation. I've been working with Eric for a very long time. Again, my name is Edie Lohman, and I'm the FEMA Region 9 National Flood Insurance Specialist. So that means I do all things flood insurance for the National Flood Insurance Program. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you so much for your time. So I'm going to take the next, I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing some important information about flood insurance. And as you probably have gathered from Ben's introduction and Mario's presentation and Eric's information, the National Flood Insurance Program is really more than an insurance program. It's a multifaceted federal government program that really identifies and manages flood risks through several different programs. Mapping is one of those that Eric just talked about. Floodplain management is another component where we ensure that buildings are constructed safely from flood risk. We have a grant program as part of the NFIP that allows communities access to federal government funding and other funding in order to keep buildings safe and to keep people safe. And then the program, of course, offers flood insurance as a mitigation option to property owners in communities that participate in the program. All of this with the primary goal in mind of preservation of lives and properties. So we want to keep people and property safe. Let's go to the next slide if we could. So as Mario already discussed, how does the NFIP work? Well, FEMA agrees to make flood insurance available within a community when the community agrees to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations, which it has to do with how new buildings are constructed. And that's based upon identified flood risks on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, as Eric just described. And participation in the NFIP, as Mario pointed out, one of the important aspects of a community participating is if the community participates in the NFIP, it makes the residents eligible for additional amounts and types of federal disaster assistance in any type of federally declared disaster, not just flood. So it's an important component of participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. All 4 counties in Hawaii do participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, which means that NFIP flood insurance is available throughout the entire state. Currently, Hawaii has about 60,403 NFIP policies. Most of those are in Honolulu County, followed by Maui, Hawaii County, and then Kauai County. So we have a lot of policies in the state of Hawaii. Let's go to the next slide if we could. And Mario and Ben also mentioned the community rating system. So I won't go into this, but I do want to give a little shout out to the entire state of Hawaii and all of the counties, because all 4 counties in Hawaii go above and beyond the minimum standards required to participate in the NFIP and to mitigate flood risk. And so NFIP policyholders statewide are eligible for premium discounts, for annual premium discounts. Because of their great work in the city and county of Honolulu, all NFIP policyholders are eligible for 10% annual discount on their NFIP premiums. There's a lot of work involved in participating in the community rating system. So hats off to all the counties in Hawaii who participate. I think it is our only state across the country where all of the counties do participate and benefit from the community rating system. So next slide. And someone asked this in the chat, which was a great question. These are the what you see on the screen are the congressionally set maximum amounts of NFIP flood insurance coverage available for residential and commercial buildings and for personal property or your personal contents or business contents. The maximum coverage for a residential building that we offer under the National Flood Insurance Program is $250,000 on the building and $100,000 for personal contents. So these maximums for residential buildings also apply to residential condominium units. The maximums for commercial buildings are $500,000 on the building, $500,000 on contents. Probably not a lot of money to cover the real estate on the West Coast or like the East Coast, New York area, Connecticut, where the property values are very high. So there is an option to purchase excess flood insurance coverage. That's available in the private flood insurance market through your local insurance agent, who can provide you with more coverage options and quotes for anything above and beyond what the National Flood Insurance Program maximums are. These, because the National Flood Insurance Program is a federal government program, I think it's worth pointing out that most of what FEMA administers in the National Flood Insurance Program, if not all, is embedded in federal legislation and the Code of Federal Regulations. And these are things that are passed by Congress. So let's go to the next slide. So that also includes when flood insurance is mandatory. Under the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, which was passed by Congress, lenders must determine when flood insurance is required using the most current FEMA flood insurance rate map. And Eric talked a little bit about this. Flood insurance is mandatory if the structure being used as collateral for a federally backed loan is located in any type of flood zone that starts with the letter A as in Adam or V as in Victor, and is on the most current FEMA flood insurance rate map. So we're looking at structures, or lenders are looking at structures that are in any type of A zone or V zone, because that's what they're required to do under the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973. And so lenders monitor on an ongoing basis map changes, who is coming into a special flood hazard area or one of these A or V zones, and who is coming out of special flood hazard areas. So they monitor that on an ongoing basis, and they do notify borrowers in writing when flood insurance is required. They will give you written advance notice. They will also generally notify you when your structure is being removed from a special flood hazard area into a low to moderate risk flood zone that Eric showed us on some of his map samples. However, lenders under the Flood Disaster Protection Act are also required to place flood insurance coverage when the borrower fails to provide proof of flood insurance within 45 days of written notification from their lender. So the lender, when maps change, lenders are monitoring these changes on an ongoing basis, and they will notify property owners in writing and give them 45 days advance notice to let them know that a mandatory flood insurance requirement applies and that they should show the lender proof of flood insurance. If the 45 days pass, the lender is required under the federal law to place flood insurance on that property. They have, when they get audited on a regular basis by their auditing auditors, they will be looking for the lender compliance with the federal law. If the lender is out of compliance with the federal law, they can be fined. So that's why lenders monitor this very closely. If a lender places flood insurance, it is outside the National Flood Insurance Program, and it can be more expensive for the borrower if the lender places the coverage through a private flood insurer. So we always encourage folks to heed the letters that come from their lenders and talk to their insurance agent as early as possible. So let's go to the next slide. So where can I buy flood insurance? So to learn more about flood insurance options, coverage, and pricing, what you want to do is contact your local insurance agent. If you don't have a local insurance agent that writes that can write an NFIP policy, or if you just want general information on the National Flood Insurance Program, you can visit our website at www.floodsmart.gov. Or you can call toll-free 1-877-336-2627, and they can provide you with a list of agents who write NFIP flood insurance coverage. They can also give you general information about the National Flood Insurance Program, but your insurance agent can give you a quote for an NFIP policy, as well as a private flood insurance policy, so that you can compare premiums and coverages, because lenders accept coverage from both the NFIP and from private flood insurance companies. So you do have the option of shopping around and getting the best coverage for the best price. And we do encourage you to do that through your local insurance agent. So let's go to the next slide, if we could. So ask your agent about the NFIP's newly mapped discount. In the case where your flood zone, you're currently in a flood zone, D is in David, B is in boy, C is in cat, or X is in X-ray. If you're in any one of those 4 flood zones and you're being remapped into a special flood hazard area or high risk flood hazard area, the A zones or the V zones, for the first time, ask your agent about the NFIP's newly mapped discount. This is a unique discount to the NFIP that offers a one-time statutory discount for property owners whose buildings are being remapped from a D, B, C, or X zone into any type of A or V flood zone. To be eligible, your NFIP policy must be purchased and coverage must be effective within 12 months of the new map effective date. So when the new map goes effective, you have 12 months from that date to get your coverage purchased and get your coverage effective. Waiting periods before coverage becomes effective vary. So you want to speak to your insurance agent early on and ask about the newly mapped discount under the National Flood Insurance Program. And let's go to the next slide. So finally, please consider talking to your insurance agent about flood insurance, regardless of your flood zone. Floods happen anywhere. Floods don't read flood maps. So everyone is at risk. It's just dependent upon what your level of risk is. 50% of our claims in the National Flood Insurance Program actually originate from low to moderate risk flood zones. And that really catches people by surprise. So we want you to know that ahead of time, talk to your insurance agent early, protect yourself and protect your family and protect the life that you have built. Consider purchasing flood insurance regardless of your flood zone. Your local insurance agent can offer you more information and a quote, whether it's through the NFIP or through a private flood insurance carrier. And thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Edie. I just muted myself. We have a few questions in the chat, and I'm trying to track. I think that Eric and a few others are responding, but maybe take a look there, Edie, as well.
I will. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Edie, there's a question on what constitutes a flood. I'm not sure if you're able to provide the NFIP definition of a flood.
Sure, as soon as I find the mute button. Right, so it can be from any source. It's surface water from any source displaced over 2 acres or 2 properties is the simple definition. And one thing that folks don't realize is, let's say, and I won't go into too many examples, but I will go into some that are worth noting. Let's say, for example, a dam breaks or a levee breaks. And the floodwaters displaced over 2 acres or 2 properties, one of which is your property. That would be considered a flood. We have situations where drains back up, storm drains back up, or they're non-existent. And so if that floodwater let's say, for example, floods the street in front of your house, it jumps the curb, and that water goes into your house, that's considered two properties. That would be considered a flood by our definition. Under the NFIP, you would have coverage for that. I have had people along the coast say, well, NFIP doesn't cover things like salt water. We do. It just has to meet that general and temporary condition of flooding. It has to be surface water, and it has to be displaced over 2 acres or 2 properties. And 2 properties can be the street and your home, the street and your business. It can be the field next door or the mountain in back of you and your house. So I'll stop there. But happy to share more. And there's also more information on floodsmart.gov. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Edie. And a few more questions are coming into the chat, and I just wanted to share that we have sort of wrapped up the formal presentation now. So if folks have questions, continue to drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to monitor and address them here in these extra few minutes that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. I see one of the questions has to do if the owner of the property doesn't have a mortgage, and how could this map revision impact you? So if you don't have a mortgage, it's important to realize there would be nobody to require flood insurance. But then again, our goals of increasing resilience and having worked disasters, seeing how people impacted by that flood disaster or other hazard, really our challenge to bounce back without adequate insurance is important to realize. So if you don't have a lender, the flood insurance would not be required, but it's something to consider. It's something we strongly encourage all property owners to consider. And then the other big aspect of these flood maps is on new development, whether that's all new construction or a substantial improvement or substantial damage. The city and county of Honolulu has their ordinance we heard about, which requires new development in flood-prone areas to be reasonably safe. And so we very much encourage that safer development, those higher standards, and that could be an expansion of an existing building or a brand new building, or again, substantial improvements. So just wanted to add that aspect too. Thanks, Chelsea.
Sounds good. And we just added some additional resources here to hang out in the background while we continue to address questions.
Yeah, as my panelists take a look at some of these questions coming in the chat, and we try to keep on top of that. These additional resources are really some great information that FEMA has on its website, as well as others. The second from the bottom, there's a website for FEMA's Mapping and Insurance Exchange. So for short, FMIX. The website's there. That's a resource anybody can contact, whether by email or by phone. And they also have live chat to answer really any questions about flood mapping or the insurance side. So if in the future you have questions, the phone number is 877-336-2627. The call center there is on the east coast of the mainland, but is available for much of the day and can also send via email. So just wanted to highlight that resource to all. Thank you. Yeah, this is Eric Simmons again, and I saw a question about retaining walls and flood risk designations and how, kind of physical features can impact that, because levees or retaining walls do impact the flood hazards. There are actually federal regulations on how FEMA needs to map flood hazards around levee systems. As far as retaining walls, the engineers that do the studies, we have field visits and look at and see the structures along these streams, for example. It could be culverts or bridges or retaining walls. It could be weirs or other physical features, and have the hydraulic modeling reflect those. So that could impact the analyses and where the water flows and where the water is modeled. So just an update there. The flood insurance study, that report that supports the flood insurance rate map and the panels, flood map panels, has some information on those. So that flood insurance study, the preliminary or what's currently in effect, is available on FEMA's Map Service Center website. So the link's been posted a couple times, msc.fema.gov. And so that's another resource for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And I saw a question came in just to the host and panelists about an average cost of a mandatory NFIP plan. Is there an average cost that you're able to share? I'm not sure if that's something that we have.
Hi, Chelsea. There really isn't, because it is dependent upon the individual characteristics of the building, although that is a great question. But that's where the insurance agents come into play, because they have access to both quotes for private flood and also quotes for the NFIP. And I'm seeing a couple of questions in here, and if you'll allow me, I kind of want to address some of these. I think that it's important for folks to realize that the National Flood Insurance Program, we generally offer coverage on most buildings. And when I say most buildings, I mean it's insurable with us pretty much 99.9% of the time. There are some buildings that are not insurable, like buildings that are completely over water, but most of them are. However, it's also important to know that there is private insurance out there, and some private insurance carriers sell both. They offer both NFIP coverage and private flood insurance coverage. So FEMA doesn't control what the private flood insurers do. They can select who they insure and what their coverage terms and pricing are for those policies. That's different than the NFIP. The NFIP only has authority over their program, the National Flood Insurance Program. So once you get outside the NFIP, it is a different story. And Eric, I did see Alvin had a question about, he has a situation where, I think it was Alvin, he has a situation where, his building is out, but his property, part of his property is in, and he was asking about, mandatory purchase. And so the question there is, from the flood insurance standpoint, is under the federal law, the lender's looking at the footprint of the building, not the land around the building. However, it is the lender's prerogative to require flood insurance in any flood zone. But if they do that, it's at their own discretion. And usually it's a safety and soundness issue, or that directive comes from their federal regulator, whoever's regulating them. But Eric, maybe I can toss the second part of that to you to talk about how they would be able to apply for a letter of map amendment out as shown.
Yes. So FEMA has this letter of map amendment process where sometimes structures are inadvertently included in the special flood hazard area, but are on higher ground. And then in other areas where, for whatever reason, lenders thinking that the building is in the special flood hazard area, but it's clearly out. If the structure is clearly out of that high risk map zone, then the homeowner or another person can apply for that letter of map amendment out as shown, OAS, and with the information that it's clearly out, or in the case of a typical letter of map amendment where the lowest ground touching the structure is at or above that base flood elevation, then FEMA writes a letter, and it's a standard letter. Thousands of these get issued a year, called a letter of map amendment, saying that that building is not in the special flood hazard area. And so that is typically done for a building, but it can also be done for a legally defined lot or a parcel. And then most lenders, when they receive that letter of map amendment, stop requiring the purchase of flood insurance. And so it's good to work with your lender to see if they would accept that LOMA to then not require flood insurance. But that's definitely an option. So lots of information online on FEMA's website for letter of map amendment, LOMA. And that FMIX, the FEMA Mapping and Insurance Exchange, is also experts at helping property owners go through that process. Thanks, Edie.
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Yeah, this is Eric again, and I see a question about reservoirs and proposed flood zones downstream of those reservoirs and dam breaks. And I think it's also important to realize, there are different sets of flood maps out there. There's dam failure evacuation zones, for example, which, is typically a more extreme scenario than this 1% annual chance flood, which is the standard, the base for the National Flood Insurance Program and producing these FEMA flood maps. So the hydrologic analyses that are the basis of these FEMA flood zones don't take in consideration a more remote chance of a dam failure. That's still a possibility, something to be aware of, but aren't mapped. The dam failures are not mapped as FEMA flood insurance rate zones. So important to realize that too. Thank you.
And Eric, if I might, there's a couple of questions in the chat that talk about cost. So I want to address that a little bit because we just talked about that on one slide. So not speaking for the private flood insurance carriers, but for the NFIP. The NFIP has a unique program that Congress put in place that offers a newly mapped, what they call a newly mapped discount. And I did talk a little bit about it during the presentation, but maybe to expand a little bit, it provides a pretty significant discount for those property owners who are do not currently have a mandatory purchase requirement and they have a federally backed loan. And this map change will be revised and they will be in a special flood hazard area where the lender will recognize that and ask that they show proof of flood insurance under the federal law. That's where this newly mapped discount would be a great conversation to have with your insurance agent. And that's why I mentioned it. We're a little bit far out from the maps becoming effective. But what I find is if I tell the property owners about the discounted program, they will start talking to their insurance agents about it because it provides a fairly substantial discount. And then that discount carries over from year to year with just an average annual increase. But it starts out low and it's not thousands and thousands of dollars, or at least not that I have ever seen in this program. So that's why I wanted to mention it. I didn't go into a lot of detail because it is a little early on and we wanted to focus on the actual map change itself. But from the insurance perspective, it is good to note that the minute those maps go effective, you can go to your insurance agent and ask them about this newly mapped discount under the NFIP. And you can get a quote for that, which I really do encourage you to do. And also, as I mentioned, feel free to get a quote for private insurance as well. And some people prefer that because the private insurance market can offer more coverage than what the NFIP statutorily can offer folks. And some people do want that additional coverage. But we do have that newly mapped discount. It's just that you have to purchase the coverage and you have to have it effective within 12 months of the new map effective date. So you have a year to do it. But your lender is going to be knocking on your door shortly after the map goes effective. And we'll be talking about this on the 6th when we have the open house. And we'll also be doing more outreach and education. We'll be talking to the insurance agents, the lenders, the realtors, as we get closer to the actual effective date of the map, so that folks will be prepared. So this is not the last time that you're going to hear about the options that are available. Let's see, somebody had a question. Oh, Carol, can you share info on transfer of policies? Right, okay, that's a great point. Thank you, Carol. So National Flood Insurance Program policies are transferable. So one of the benefits of locking into the newly mapped policy, if you will, even if you don't have a federally backed mortgage, is, let's say you don't have a federally backed mortgage. However, you're being remapped from a lower moderate risk area into a higher risk area. where flood insurance is going to be mandatory, and then you put your house up for sale and I buy your house, but I need a loan, a federally backed loan to buy your house. You can transfer your discounted policy to me so that, you know, that's going to be a benefit as part of the real estate transaction, so that you can carry that newly mapped, and I can carry that newly mapped discounted policy forward as long as there's no break in coverage. So that's a really important point. Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, appreciate that, Edie. And I guess I just wanted to add one more point, maybe before we transition to the final poll and reminder of future activities. And there's been some comments about maintenance and future conditions, and it's important to realize the studies that FEMA maps on these flood insurance rate maps are based on existing conditions. So that's the vegetation or the channel conditions at the time of the study. So sometimes we get questions about sea level rise or future conditions, hazards, and there's a place for having that information, but right now FEMA flood maps reflect existing conditions. So just wanted to stress that point there. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And I see a few more questions have come in, I think just to us, to the hosts and panelists, including a question about having a side conversation. So flagging that for you and Edie to respond to. I think we can respond to those directly. Great. And I think questions have started to slow down, and I've noticed that people are starting to drop off. So I think we can go ahead and stop the recording, but I want to just pause and make sure that's okay, Edie, Eric, others, and I'll take a last look at the chat. Great questions. All right, I think, oh, actually one question from Glenn. Where can I find those maps of the stormwater ditch?
Yeah, this is Eric again, and I know there was some chats about stormwater canals and streams versus coastal flooding. So it's important to realize what a FEMA flood map shows and doesn't show. FEMA flood maps do show hazards from coastal flooding as well as streams. That could be a canal or other riverine flooding source. There's also a type of flooding sometimes called pluvial, or also stormwater, where it's small drainage areas. And that's something that FEMA maps do not show. That's stormwater flood conditions, maybe from a neighborhood swale or just ponding along an embankment. So FEMA doesn't study those stormwater conditions, nor map them on a flood insurance rate map. Thank you. And I guess I also see a comment there about notices for when the flood maps are finalized. So typically at that stage, most of FEMA's coordination is with the city and county. FEMA does do a Federal Register publication. That's a public notice. Most people don't read a Federal Register, but that's something noted there. I'll coordinate at that time with the city and county. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And I think that was a great question to end on.